All right, good morning and welcome. Public workshop is called to order. I'm Felicia Marcus, Chair of the State Water Board. Notice I only say that when someone gives me a thing that says my name is Felicia Marcus. Otherwise, I introduce my colleagues and not myself. I only realize it when I look at this thing, so you can remind me if I should be doing it. It's kind of rude not to say who I am when I start, right?
Because none of us would know who you are.
No, but I mean, everybody there or listening wouldn't know who's talking, so I need to get that right too.
I'll make sure I put it in the script.
Yeah, I don't use the script anymore generally, but this was formal, so I'm supposed to do this. Also with me to my left, Vice Chair Fran Spivey Weber. To her left, Board Member Didi Diadamo. To my right, Board Member Tam Dodek. And to her right, Board Member Steve Moore. The purpose of the workshop is to introduce and solicit comments and questions on the proposed amendments to the California Ocean Plan to address impacts to marine life from desalination facilities, also known as the Desalination Amendment. Let me also, see, I get to introduce the staff present today as opposed to you. I don't know why this is different in a workshop or why we're supposed to do that. Chief Deputy Director Jonathan Bishop, you guys now, but I'll make you raise your hand when I introduce you so people know who you are. Assistant Deputy Director Phil Crater, Watershed, Ocean, and Wetlands Section Chief, WOW Section Chief Paul Han, Ocean Unit Chief Mariela Paz Carpio Obeso, Senior Staff Counsel Marley Wood, and Ocean Unit Environmental Scientist Claire Wagoner. There we go. Now, emergency evacuation, check to see where the nearest exits are. If you hear the emergency sound, grab your stuff, grab your friends, go out safely. We meet in Cesar Chavez Park, kind of over towards the left. If you want to know when the all clear comes and we're going to be coming back here, stay there. Otherwise, you can do whatever you want, of course. The workshop's being held in accordance with public notice dated July 3rd, 2014 to receive public input on the proposed desalination amendment and draft staff report, including draft substitute environmental documentation. If you intend to speak on this issue, please fill out a blue speaker card and give it to the clerk located in the front of the room. If you're not sure if you want to speak, fill out a card and mark it if necessary. The deadline for submittal of written comments on the draft documents is August 19th at noon. If you've already submitted written comments to the board, please briefly summarize your comments when it's your turn to speak. We will have time limits on oral comments to allow all participants the opportunity to be heard. Important, the board will not act on the draft amendments today. There won't be sworn testimony. The workshop is being recorded, so when you come up to the microphone, it is very important that you speak very closely in it. Even if you think the people around you can hear, we want to make sure the people on the webcast can also hear, and that the recording of DVDs people can get is also clear. I'm going to call the speakers in the order we have blue cards. Some people have asked to speak for slightly longer. I think I understood about 10 minutes, and since the room isn't jammed, I think that's fine, and we'll ask others to hold their comments to 5 minutes. When you do come to the podium, please speak your name slowly and identify the organization you represent, if any. We're going to start with a staff presentation by Claire Wagner, followed by public comments. Take it away, Claire.
Okay, good morning. Can you hear me okay? All right. Good morning, Chair Marcus and board members.
You might want to move it closer to you, actually. And then, yeah, move it down. Right. It works better that way.
Is it off?
You just turned it off. All right. I just want to pause and thank you personally for participating in the California Sea Grant California Sea Grant Fellowship Program. It's afforded me the opportunity to work on this project and be here today, so thank you. As you mentioned, I'm here to introduce the proposed amendment to the Water Quality Control Plan for ocean waters to address desalination facilities. And as you also mentioned, the purpose is to discuss key components of the proposed amendment, to solicit comments, get feedback, and then staff can also answer any questions that come up. There will be, staff have been meeting in one-on-one meetings with various stakeholders to have more in-depth discussions regarding the proposed amendment, and those are going to continue throughout the public comment period, which ends August 19th. And again, there'll be no action taken by the State Water Board today. This is just an informational workshop. The documents were posted online July 3rd. We had initially posted the proposed desalination amendment in Appendix A, which was sort of buried in the ocean plan where it would be if it were to be adopted. And we found that it was very hard to find. So we've since then posted it separately in a non-red line strikeout form, so it's now available and more accessible. I'll reiterate, the comment deadline ends August 19th at noon. This is also the same day as the public hearing, which is at 9 a.m.
And then we won't take action that day. We'll consider it, respond to comments, and take action as soon thereafter as we can.
Yeah, that's correct. So we're here because during the 2011 to 2013 Ocean Plan Triennial Review, the State Water Board identified desalination and brine discharges as a board priority. And this is because there was a number of desalination projects that had been proposed along the California coastline, and desalination activities have the potential to negatively affect water quality and other beneficial uses. So for example, some types of desalination intakes, like surface water intakes, can impinge or entrain marine life. And impingement occurs as water is being drawn into the facility and organisms can't swim away from the draw and can become trapped against the intake screens. This can result in bodily damage, stress, and mortality. For those organisms that do make it through the screen and are entrained into the system, they typically have 100% mortality as they enter the facility's water processing equipment. The desalination process removes salts from the source water to produce the fresh water, and the salts that are removed typically end up in a brine that's discharged into the ocean. And depending on how this is done, it can form a dense, negatively buoyant plume that can just settle and spread on the seafloor. In addition to having toxic effects, it can also create anoxic zones where there's not adequate oxygen mixing in the benthic environment. For brine discharges through multi-port diffusers, this rapidly disperses the brine, which reduces the area in which there are toxic effects. However, there can be shearing-related mortality. So if you look at this image, the second one down, it's a laser-induced fluorescence animation. And this is a way of visualizing two things. First, you can sort of see that the warmer colors, the reds and the yellows, would be an area where you would have higher concentrations of brine. And then the cooler colors is as the concentration dissipates. You can also look at this to visualize where the shearing-related mortality would be the highest, and that would also be in the warmer colors along the red line. So in addition to discharge-related mortality, construction can also have associated marine life mortality, even though the construction would typically be temporary. And then also there's an issue of seawater intrusion for improperly sited subsurface intakes. They have the potential to exacerbate seawater intrusion, which can irreversibly contaminate freshwater supplies. Now, the current version of the ocean plan doesn't have provisions to adequately address the impacts from desalination facilities. Desalination facilities are currently permitted on a case-by-case basis by the regional water boards that will either issue a waste discharge requirement or NPDES permit, but this can result in regional inconsistencies. So staff are proposing to amend the ocean plan to address desalination facilities as well as to incorporate other non-substantive changes. Now, some of the non-substantive changes are to facilitate the insertion of the proposed amendment, but then we're also doing things like general housekeeping, so punctuation and things like that will be taken care of. Now, the overarching goal of this project is to ensure that California has a diverse water supply portfolio while at the same time protecting marine resources.
Sorry, I'm liking the flying fish moving around the bottom of these pages. You need to get me that,
I will.
that little template.
I'm glad somebody like that other than me.
Yeah. I'm enjoying it for some reason.
Now, some of the specific project goals include providing a consistent statewide approach that's based on the best available science for minimizing intake and mortality of marine life, as well as protecting water quality and the related beneficial uses of ocean waters. One of the secondary goals is to include flexibility for facility-specific considerations as well as future technological innovations. And this is something we heard a lot about when we did our stakeholder outreach last summer, so where possible we tried to build this into the proposed amendment. And then we have a third and final goal of promoting interagency collaboration among the agencies that are involved in permitting these desalination facilities. And I'll talk more about how we've already started some of those interagency collaborations in future slides. Now, this project started in 2007. There have been 2 scoping meetings, the first in 2007, the second in 2012. And in order to get the best available science for the impacts that desalination facilities have on water quality and beneficial uses, the State Water Board commissioned a number of expert panels and scientific studies to get the information to help formulate the proposed amendment. Additionally, there were a number of public stakeholder meetings to gain the stakeholder input on different issues. And then, as I mentioned, one of the goals was to promote interagency collaboration. So we've had a number of interagency meetings, and this has been twofold. One of the things we did is we circulated draft amendments to other agencies to get the agency perspective. So we had a number of meetings, and those were really helpful in the development of the amendment. And then also the Ocean Protection Council convened interagency meetings for specific projects, and we also participated in those. So last summer, we did targeted stakeholder outreach where we took key amendment issues and options to stakeholders and got their feedback and listened to the direction that they thought we should take on specific issues. So between each of these different steps, we took the information and used it in the development of the draft amendment, the staff report, and the substitute environmental documentation that were released on July 3rd. So now to the proposed desalination amendment. It has 4 main parts. The first part deals with applicability. So which facilities would have to come into compliance with it. It also clarifies the Water Board's authority over intakes versus discharges, and that it includes definitions of new, expanded, and existing facilities. And I'll mention why this becomes important in subsequent slides. The second part of the amendment is direction for the regional water boards on how to go about conducting a California Water Code section 13142.5B determination. So this is something that would need to be done for new, expanded, or conditionally permitted facilities. A conditionally permitted facility would be, excuse me, a desalination facility that's co-located with a power plant that would be coming into compliance with the once-through cooling policy and no longer have that as an intake source water. So for those facilities that are conditionally permitted, they would need a new 13142.5B determination for the long-term standalone facility. And I'll go into more detail again about what this means and how the regional board would go about this. The third portion includes a narrative receiving water limitation for salinity, and the fourth part of the amendment includes the monitoring and reporting requirements. And so both the third and fourth part would apply to all desalination facilities. The first section, as I mentioned, deals with the applicability. So which facilities would be covered under this proposed amendment? We've defined it as desalination facilities using seawater. So this would not include desalination facilities that are desalinating inland groundwater or a bottled water company, brewery, or brine, cheese factory that might be producing a brine and discharging it into the ocean. Now there's 2 exceptions for desalination facilities using seawater. The first comes from our discussions with the Department of Defense. And they have small portable units that they deploy troops overseas with in areas where they might have seawater, but they don't have potable water. And they train with these units in California. So they had asked to continue that training. So that's where the first exception comes from. The second is a potential exception for facilities that would be operating as a critical short-term water supply during a state of emergency as declared by the governor. Now, when this was originally written, we had in mind that California has earthquakes and there's many users that have water transported to them, and that might be a problem in the time of an earthquake. So San Francisco Bay could have a barge driven up that has a desalination unit that could serve as a temporary water supply. That's where the original thought came from, and now that we're in the state of emergency drought, this is something that a facility could potentially apply to the executive director of the State Water Board for a temporary waiver, and then at his discretion, he could waive some or all of the provisions in the amendment temporarily. And then again, I mentioned the section also includes definitions of new, expanded, and existing facilities. And this is important because of the Water Board's authority to regulate intakes. It's different from the ability to regulate discharges. And this is because the authority of the Water Board to regulate intakes comes from California Water Code section 13142.5b. And this is for seawater intakes. And it says that for each new or expanded coastal power plant or other industrial installation using seawater, for cooling, heating, or industrial processing, the best available site, design, technology, and mitigation measures feasible shall be used to minimize the intake and mortality of all forms of marine life. And this is why those definitions of new, expanded, and existing become important, because we only have the authority to regulate new or expanded seawater intakes. Now, the authority to regulate discharges is broader because it's under a different section of the Water Code. So this section allows the water boards to prescribe requirements for waste discharges, which would include brine, into waters of the state, which would include the ocean. So now we're switching to the second portion of the amendment, and this is the section where we're providing direction to the regional water boards on how to go about conducting this 13142.5b determination. This is only for new, expanded, and conditionally permitted facilities, and the direction to them is to first analyze independently, as independent considerations, a range of feasible alternatives for the best site, the best design, the best technology, and the best mitigation measures to minimize intake and mortality of marine life. And then once that step's done and the best is identified for each of those four factors, the regional board would then consider all four factors collectively and include the best combination of alternatives that in combination minimize intake and mortality of marine life, recognizing the fact that it might not be feasible to include the best for each individual factor in the combination overall of factors to minimize intake and mortality of marine life. So then what we did is we broke it down further to each of the four factors to provide additional guidance. So this is guidance for how to determine the best site for, again, minimizing intake and mortality of marine life. So it includes factors to consider. For example, the regional need for desalinated water, the presence of existing infrastructure. This is something that if there's an existing pipe there and you don't have to do construction, that can minimize marine life mortality. Similarly, avoiding impacts to sensitive areas, marine protected areas. These are all things that we would want them to consider in identifying the best site. Similarly, we've provided guidance for the best design. So design elements that would minimize intake and mortality of marine life. Things that would minimize entrainment, things that would avoid the formation of a dense, negatively buoyant plume. So in this case, things like diffusers, the angle of the diffuser is important, and so that can minimize the formation of a dense plume. And similarly, for preventing the suspension of benthic sediments, the design elements of the diffuser array are important in doing so. So the third part of this is the technology, and this has been broken down into two parts. The first is the considerations for the intake technology. So the Regional Water Board would require subsurface intakes unless they're deemed to be infeasible, and there's a number of feasibility factors that they would look at and evaluate to make that determination. And if subsurface intakes are infeasible, An owner or operator could use surface water intakes as long as they're screened. Now, staff released the proposed amendment with a range of screen slot sizes, 0.5, 0.75, and 1 mil slot size screens. And the reason we did this is because that we know that smaller is better from an environmental standpoint. But once we started talking to screen manufacturers and people who might be using these in the offshore marine environment, there were questions about the operation constraints, and the smaller screen sizes tend to be more challenging for this, and so we wanted to get comments from the public.
I don't recall exactly where I saw this, but I understand that there's some new technology on subsurface, slant well, where you can bring in more volume, which is a big impediment to subsurface. Have you looked at that?
So we have read some studies about slant walls. We're familiar with certain projects that are proposing to use those, and so we're familiar that those might open the door to make subsurface something that is more feasible in the future.
Along those lines, what if we adopt something and then technology changes in the future? Do we have an opportunity at some point to come back, or is there a suggestion for a technology review in the future?
So, first off, we're not requiring any specific technology in here, and so it is open for review. There is also the general ability for us to amend policies. I am a big proponent of fixing problems in or changes that are needed in policies and permits as we move forward. So we have both those. I don't believe there's anything that requires a specific technology, though there may be, there likely will be a decision made on minimum slot size or maximum slot size, which would not preclude a smaller slot size at a future date.
So to sort of get at that point, this is one of the sections where we've included the potential for an owner-operator to use an alternative screening technology as long as they can demonstrate that it's equally protective as the screened intakes. One of the issues is that our regulatory authority only does extend to new or expanded facilities. So once those intakes are in place, I think it would be challenging to reopen and make somebody modify unless the facility was conditionally permitted, or unless we did include something in here that said provided for technological advances and made way for people to have to go back and make changes if there were technological advances.
Right, don't we, I mean, in this case, people, if they can find a superior technology, can propose it, right, as a just as good or better, but I forgot my point, sorry.
Okay.
And I'll be curious, actually, for Dee Dee to comment on this as we get, maybe toward the end, as we get into this, because the Air Board has dealt with this every day. And so what do they do?
No, but they do, what they do is similar to what we do, which is what I was going to say. In permitting, as you renew people's MPDS permits, you make a judgment about when they need to upgrade. So presumably we would have some ability, although you wouldn't make people change it every 5 years because that would be too expensive. So presumably there's some mechanism if you're talking 10 years into the future and the world has changed. Things don't stay static. If they did, we'd still be discharging primary effluent out the many outfalls at wastewater treatment plants.
That's right, but let me just point out, this situation under Water Code 13142.5B is a little bit different than what this board does.
Okay.
With respect to, say, authorizing discharges, where you're right, every time we renew a waste discharge requirements or a permit, we're looking to what the current technology has evolved to. Under 13142.5B, the board actually has limits on its authority to do that because the statute by its terms applies only to new or expanded facilities. And so if a facility is built today under current technological standards, and there is no proposal to expand it in the future, then this board really doesn't have the ability with respect to intake to require it to change technologies as technologies advance, at least not the way the statute's currently written.
All right, that's helpful. In the air context, you'd have new source review if it's substantially rebuilt, but.
Right. Now, that doesn't affect our ability to continue to improve the discharge side of things from a desal facility. It's only on the intake side. And it's again, it's sort of a unique twist for the state board to even have authority to regulate intake impacts in the first instance. We typically don't do that. This is a very special statute that gives us special authority but limits
That
that
actually
authority.
gave us the authority.
Right.
So, and I'll just comment, sort of food for thought, and I don't know that it's entirely, I doubt it's applicable. With respect to permits, you're correct, but with respect to, the reason I asked about technology review is because at the Air Board, when we were setting standards, statewide standards, we often would set a standard with respect to a technology that didn't currently exist. And we would set it on out into the future, way out into the future, in order to drive technology. This is a little different situation because we have facilities that are wanting to go forward now. And then once they get permitted, it's no longer, as you say, applicable with respect to the statute because it's an existing facility. But probably at some point, you know, when we wrap things up, I'd like to suggest a technology review, regardless of whether or not we have the authority to come back on these facilities, because it's always helpful to see this, what the state of the technological advances are.
Plus, why else would Rich come visit us periodically? We didn't do that.
Okay, great. Well, then let's move on to the considerations for the brine discharge technology. These would be, again, things that the regional board would consider. Commingling brine with wastewater is the preferred technology, and this is because wastewater is typically fresh and positively buoyant, so it can dilute the toxic effects of the brine, but it can also prevent the formation of a negatively buoyant plume because the positively buoyant wastewater can counterbalance that. In the event that wastewater is not available for dilution, multi-port diffusers are the next best method for discharging brine. So you can see in the upper, the top picture, that's a multi-port diffuser array that's out of the water, so they're typically up and angled. We can try to get the video to play. So what you're looking at here is, again, this laser-induced fluorescent imaging technology that allows you to look at this discharge from a multi-port diffuser. Warmer colors, again, would be area where you have higher concentrations of brine. You can see that it's rapidly diffused. But again, along the red areas, you would have shearing-related mortality. So even though we know there is some mortality associated with the diffusers, these still are the next preferred brine discharge technology. This is another area where we've allowed for technological innovation. So if there's alternative brine discharge technologies, this is where somebody can apply to the regional water board to be able to use those. And in the proposed amendment, we have just general provisions for the things we haven't thought of yet. We've heard of interesting things like taking the brine on a boat and discharging it underway from the surface. We've also heard about flow augmentation systems, and these are systems that withdraw additional seawater for the specific purpose of discharging brine. So there's more specific provisions in the proposed amendment because we know a little bit about those, but this is an area where, as technological advances are made, a facility could use them. Janine, can you advance the slide too? This one after the video plays doesn't like to go to the next slide. Thank you. All right, so mitigation's the fourth factor. Now we've defined this as the replacement of marine life or habitat that's lost due to the construction and operation of a desalination facility after minimizing through site design technology and technology measures. And I missed a word. You're minimizing marine life, mortality. So what an owner or operator would do is assess how much mortality is associated with their facility. They would look at the intakes, they would look at the discharges, and then any construction-related mortality. And this would be submitted to the Regional Water Board, and then an owner or operator would either complete a mitigation project or pay into a fee-based mitigation program. And when I had started on the project, we had thought that this fee-based mitigation program was something that was going to be available in the near future. And as we ran down the logistics of this, it looks like it's not going to be an option for maybe 10 years at the earliest, unless somebody really advocates the development of such a fee-based mitigation program for these type of impacts.
Oh.
But it's in there because we realize this is a long-term plan, and hopefully this will spur people to develop such a program if they want to use it.
Can you explain why a decade?
Well, so this was initially something where we were working with the Ocean Protection Council on, and they were going to be the fee-based mitigation program, but they didn't have the authority to accept or spend the funds, and so we thought it would be as simple as going and amending the budget. But it turns out it's going to take a little bit more than that. It sounds like Fish and Wildlife would like to develop such a program and is potentially working on it, but it doesn't, I don't know if there's enough support for the development of the program to have the funds to develop it. And I think that's the critical issue is the funds and the resources to develop the program.
So you're creating a space for it when it is developed, and then folks on all sides of the issue presumably would engage in getting it done, because we can't just make it so by saying so. Is that what you're saying?
So
That's interesting.
the biggest issue is that on an individual project, it might seem like a large amount of funds, but to develop a program and develop essentially a mitigation program and staff it up is the amount of funds that we would have available for this are not enough to support that program. And so it needs to be combined with other sources of funding, and so that's being worked on, but it's not available yet.
So I don't want to spend too much time on this because we can talk about it afterwards. Other programs that have fee-based mitigation as opposed to site-specific. When you're doing site-specific mitigation, you have a more contained universe of
Right, you do a
decision-making,
project
and
and-
the project's paid, like the PG&E mitigation at Songs, for
Right,
example.
you do
I've seen
one
some of that.
thing and you oversee that, as opposed
All
to
right.
gathering up funds into a bank and using them.
Are there, I remember, I'm sorry, in the 90s, when we were working on wetland mitigation banks, I spent some time on that, but I have no idea what the status of that is
So
now. Are
that's-
there wetland mitigation banks now?
There are wetland mitigation banks. They took many, many, many years to put together. They are there now. The concept here is that as we have other issues that would relate to marine life protected areas, ocean protection, that could gather funds, that this would be available for them. But right now, there isn't that.
All right, so this is where would be the place that we or others would go to advocate this? Would it be at the OPC, in the legislature, what are the vehicles?
So we'll,
It just seems like a good idea for a whole host of ocean impact.
right, it's a great idea. What we need to do is figure out where, with the folks at the Resources Agency and us together, how do we make this happen by directing more funds to it? The problem is it's too small.
Okay,
But-
that helps me understand.
But as I recall, it's not just desalination
Right.
that provides funding. It's also once through cooling,
Right, which is also,
which is on a short track, but not, but it's there.
yes, I agree. We have not been able to develop the program. We can talk more about
I know
that.
you guys, can we just do a meeting with Kat, for example,
Yep,
sometime soon?
And I would recommend that we also include Resources Legacy Fund, who might have funding to help launch something like this.
Okay,
Okay.
great, thanks.
Okay, so now we're at the end of the second section. Like to remind you that the Regional Water Board's going to look at the best for each individual and then pick the combination that works to minimize intake and mortality of marine life, recognizing that the best combination might not always include the best under each individual factor. So an example of this, that for the best technology, it might be a subsurface intake, but where that's feasible might be in a market squid nursery. And so it's going to be this balancing act that the Regional Water Board's going to have to look at. But overall, the goal, minimize intake and mortality of marine life.
Yeah, that's the bottom line.
That's the bottom line. And it's for new, expanded, or conditionally permitted facilities only. So now to the third part. This is the narrative receiving water limitation for salinity. And this is for all desalination facilities because, again, our authority over the discharges is broader. The receiving water limitation for salinity says that discharges shall not exceed a daily maximum of 2 parts per thousand above natural background salinity to be measured as total dissolved solids no further than 100 meters horizontally from the discharge, and there's no vertical limit to this zone. So this comes from one of our expert review panel's findings, as well as one of the studies that we had commissioned, and that formulated the base for this receiving water limitation. Again, we've built in an opportunity for a facility-specific consideration, so an owner or operator can apply for an alternative receiving water limitation, and the proposed amendment goes into greater detail about how they would go about that process. The fourth and final part of the amendment is the monitoring and reporting requirements. So as usual, a discharger would submit their monitoring and reporting plan to the Regional Water Board, and the monitoring requirements would be similar to what's in the current ocean plan in the model monitoring requirements. The only differences would be that in areas where regional monitoring is an option, desalination facilities wouldn't be able to participate in regional monitoring until the Regional Water Board determines that there's enough facility-specific data to have that be an appropriate option. And then there's other things like conducting a before-after control impact survey, and that's really just to understand what's there before you start discharging, and then you can track that over time as the discharge starts.
In determining what is best, what standards are we using? Is this best available technology, as in the kind of EPA talk, or
So it's,
what's our standard?
I'll let Phil.
Thank you, Phil.
You're looking over here. And I guess I should introduce myself too. Phil Wiles, Assistant Chief Counsel for the board.
Did I not introduce you, make you raise your hand? No,
You
you
did
should do
not.
that as you speak anyway, because people can't see you raise your hand
And
over
I'll
the web
introduce
anyway.
Janine Townsend, the clerk to the board, because
Yeah, that's right, thank you,
poor
you're right.
Janine.
She who must be obeyed.
So the answer to the question, are we using best available technology or some other standard that exists in some other statutory scheme? The answer is no, we're not. With respect to, and I should be clear, with respect to 13142.5b, it refers to essentially the best feasible site design, mitigation, and technology. It doesn't import notions from other statutory schemes. It's just what we think, what the board thinks is the best way to interpret that specific statute. With respect to receiving water limitations, there is obviously a tie to both the Porter Cologne Act and the Clean Water Act in terms of what we're requiring there. But what we have is a receiving water limitation. It's not, the receiving water limitation itself isn't really technology driven. It's more the area of the receiving water in the ocean that can be affected above 2 parts per thousand above baseline. So sort of just to kind of summarize then, we've had questions, is this BAT? And the answer is no, it's not BAT. It's best feasible as the board interprets Water Code 13142.5b.
But it does sound like then perhaps Dee Dee, we might be needing to have that review of technology earlier rather than later if we're going to establish what is best.
Yeah, and
I mean,
so,
we're going to have to make those decisions, correct?
right,
or
as
the
we go
regional
through
board does.
as we go through the plan amendment, you'll see that in most cases, for example, the intake technology. I mean, I can't think of any other technologies besides taking it directly out of the ocean versus subsurface. Those are sort of the two technologies that are obvious as we think of things today. However, if and we've established a preference order. We prefer subsurface if it's feasible, but there's an opportunity to not do it if it's shown that it's not feasible. If over time we come to a different conclusion, that either there's a third technology that you could use to intake seawater, or if we decide that we were wrong and actually surface intakes are better in terms of minimizing intake and mortality than subsurface, then we would need to change the ocean plan if it's adopted in its current form.
But that would only extend to new facilities, or the
Absolutely
the
right. That would
category
only
for-
apply to facilities that are not yet existing and don't plan to expand. That's correct.
So what would be, I guess this is getting back to that, the permit issue at the regional board level. In the event that there's a major breakthrough in technology, what role would the regional board have in order to apply that to existing facilities?
If the technology is about intake, design, site, for the purposes of minimizing intake or mortality, if it's an existing facility, neither the regional board nor the state board would have any authority because the statute applies only to new and expanded facilities. So we really are essentially locking in whatever the desalination facility is at the time it's approved, based on what we understand about technology at that time, and it stays that way unless there's a proposal to expand the facility, or unless it's what Claire referred to as conditionally approved in the first instance, where we know something's going to change, like, for example, a power plant's going to stop using their intakes and it'll be all used for desalination purposes only. Now, that's based on the current statute. If there's a concern that technology makes rapid advances and that these facilities should keep up with technology over time, that would be something to take to the legislature.
You know, in this regard, since the discussions around, you know, the static nature of our action, you know, in terms of the intake side of the coin, there is also a sort of a life of project component, you know, in terms of the infrastructure needing to be replaced, you know, and so the intake will, in these kind of environmental conditions, become corroded eventually. Even if 316 stainless steel is used, that isn't infinite either. So is there a point where you know, the construction, the repair of the structure, if there are any authority that the regional boards would have in terms of a 401 certification type, going into the ocean and doing construction to replace an intake structure? Is there any opportunity there to take advantage of what the latest technology might be?
So as I'm thinking about Clean Water Act 401 certification, that really is more focused on the discharge side. And so rather than the ongoing intake of a replacement intake structure, the way that the draft amendment attempts to deal with this issue is in the definition of expanded.
Oh.
And so we tried to explain what we think an expanded facility is, such that then the policy and the regional board would then have essentially a new obligation to apply whatever the ocean plan says at that point. And so the definition that's in the current draft is if the owner or the operator of the desalination facility either increases the amount of seawater used by the facility, or changes the design or operation of the facility. And so we don't actually explicitly take into account something like replaces.
The exact replacement.
Right.
Right.
Something to consider, though.
So I would like to put this in a little bit of context, because we have water intakes all over the state that we don't regulate all the time. And so it is a difference in our regulations. We regulate discharge. There's a specific instance here that we have authority that the legislature gave us. But for the most part, intakes for drinking water supplies are not regulated,
Really?
by us. Now, the fisheries agencies do have some screening requirements for certain intakes and things like that, but it's not under our authority.
So you have power plants that we did once through cooling.
Under both state and federal.
Right.
And so there's a difference, because the power plants have 316B requirements, and those don't apply to industrial intakes.
It's just always so interesting.
It is.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I'll press on.
Thanks.
We're almost towards the end. This is the just steps moving forward. We're here at the public workshop. Next step would be the public hearing and close of the public comment period. So that's August 19th, 9 a.m. is the public hearing. All written comments are due by noon. So then staff's going to compile the comments, respond to them. We'll brief the board members, get direction, make any changes that need to be made before we release the final draft amendment, hopefully in the fall of 2014. If all goes well, then it would go up for board consideration for adoption the following winter. And if adopted, then it would be submitted to the Office of Administrative Law for approval and then submitted to the US EPA. So
Now, can you remind me, I know I should know this, having been the US EPA, but does it take effect while they're considering it, or does it not take effect until they've decided on it?
you can go.
We don't actually view this as requiring EPA approval because it's not a standards action, so
Right,
we
so that
believe
be
it
the
would take
same as our
effect
view on
upon
budget.
OAL approval.
So as I mentioned earlier, we've been doing one-on-one stakeholder outreach meetings. We'd like to extend the invitation to anybody who we haven't met with, or if you would like to meet again, we'd be more than happy to meet with you during the public comment period. So if you're interested in meeting, we can set up a phone call or meeting. You can just contact me and I'd like to set something up. So thank you for your time, and that concludes the staff presentation.
And thank you for all your time on this, as well as all the time with the stakeholders. It helps, and I encourage people to take advantage of it, because then your comments, when they come in, will be more focused on the proposal, and the staff will be that much further ahead in thinking about your very good thoughts, comments, concerns, suggestions, etc. So, great. All right. First, on the pile here, we have Bob Yamada from San Diego County Water Authority. Well, the question is, what? I'd set it for 5, unless Bob asked for more time. I don't know that Bob did ask for more time, did he? Okay. He
Good
can be
morning.
concise.
Yes. Good morning, board members. Good to see you all again. And I just wanted to open with a big thank you to you, the board, and the staff for the very open and transparent process that's been conducted here with regard to taking input and especially not only taking input, but striving to listen to our concerns. And it's evident from the draft amendment that there's been a real effort to try to address our concerns, and we sincerely appreciate that. We also want to acknowledge the amount of work that went into preparing the amendment in the SED, and it's obviously took a lot of time and effort to prepare that and a lot of research, and we sincerely appreciate that as well. First of all, I wanted to reiterate the San Diego County Water Authority perspective on desalination, that we see it as a part of, not the whole piece of, a diversified water supply portfolio that is a mix of both traditional and new sources. And Obviously, it's a drought-proof supply of water, but it's also complementary and not intended to be competitive with other new sources such as potable reuse. We see them as working hand in hand with each other to improve and bolster our reliability. That said, we also view take quite seriously our responsibility for environmental stewardship with regard to developing an environmental responsible desalination plant. We're pleased to see that one of the goals and stated goals in the amendment is to support the use of ocean water as a reliable supplement to traditional water supplies, and we appreciate the recognition of desalinated ocean water as a new reliable supply, not just for San Diego County, but for other coastal areas in California. Toward that end, I just wanted to report on the progress of the Carlsbad project. Currently, construction is more than 50% complete, and when it's complete, hopefully late next year, the project will provide more than 7% of our overall water supply and will more than double the amount of local water that has been developed in our region since 1991. With regard to the amendment, we will be providing some detailed comments in a letter, but I wanted to address a few high-level issues that we hope will be addressed before the final amendment is adopted, according to the schedule that Claire just laid out for us. The first is reliability. The current statewide drought just accentuates the need for local water supplies that can be relied upon day in and day out. And so we would ask that you consider very carefully the requirements in the amendment, such as intake screen slot size and the length of time required for various field studies. Such requirements could impact the reliable operations of a desal facility or delay or shut down a facility unnecessarily for a lengthy period, and that all those things are not good, especially during a drought.
Is that a concern that if our slot size is too small, the maintenance is more difficult?
Yes.
All right.
The second issue is practicality and consistency. We would ask for your consideration in ensuring that the final amendment does not impose impractical requirements that also may not be consistent with other regulations and findings. A few examples. Again, the practicality of the smaller screen sizes given the lack of full-scale operating data that's out there. The practicality of constructing and operating different intake types that are going to have vastly different water quality and pretreatment requirements. Consistency with other ocean plan regulations, consistency with the expert panel review findings, and to the extent possible, alignment with already established permits and mitigation requirements, and obviously I'm thinking specifically of the Carlsbad project. Also wanted to talk briefly and provide some input on this issue of technology that you've been discussing. Because this is going to be, in the case of Carlsbad, a potable water supply that we are counting on, we are very careful with regard to the application of new technologies. We always look for the best technologies that have been proven in a long-term commercial application or municipal application. So I would caution us on this issue of technology and ask that the board and staff consider a technology-neutral approach to the policy as much as possible. And lastly, I would ask for your consideration in providing clarity specifically to the regional boards with regard to the term feasibility that is referenced in the draft amendment. The amendment tasks the regional boards with determining feasibility or infeasibility as it relates, in some cases, for example, subsurface intakes. We think there is a ready-made definition that was provided in the Swrcb versus Regional Board Court of Appeal decision. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to speak and look forward to the public hearing and the submission of our comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Peter McLagan, Poseidon Water.
Good morning, Madam Chair, board members.
All right.
Thank you for the opportunity to comment on the draft ocean plan amendment for desalination facilities. Poseidon Water is the owner and the operator of the Carlsbad Desalination Project that we're advancing in partnership with the San Diego County Water Authority. And I would just like to start by thanking staff and the board for hearing our comments and giving consideration to our prior comments on the preparation of this rulemaking process, and specifically thank the staff. They've provided tremendous access. They've listened closely, and the draft document that before you represents a lot of the input that we have put into this process, and we thank everybody for listening. The reason why this is important, of course, is because the State of California is committed to seawater desalination as a future water supply, and we need to make sure we get the rulemaking process right so it supports that undertaking, as well as protecting the goal of providing suitable water quality. So we support the twin goals, and we'll work carefully with the board and staff to continue to advance those objectives. We are pleased that the draft OPA provides consideration for site-specific conditions. This includes the pathways for owners and operators of desalination facilities to propose alternative means of compliance for stated water quality objectives. We think this is important. There's been a lot of talk this morning about looking to alternative technologies and allowing the best and brightest ideas to come forward, and your plan that's before you moves in that direction, and we support that. We're still reviewing the document. We're going to be providing written comments before the close of the comment deadline, but I did want to share with you a few observations on our review today, starting with the intakes and the discharge proposals. The staff recommendation is to provide a technology-neutral approach to selection of brine discharge technology, and we fully agree with this recommendation. Unfortunately, as you look at the carryover of that recommendation from the staff report into the OPA, it doesn't quite carry over, and there are some stated preferences and biases for certain technologies that we think need to be ironed out, so all technology has the level playing field to move forward and works under the same approval requirements, that there's not preference for one versus another. And we also think that the water code requires this approach. With respect to feasibility, Bob touched upon this, and your counsel, Mr. Wiles, was very much involved in the 13142.5B process on the Carlsbad project down in San Diego. We're all aware that one of the more contentious aspects of this discussion is what is the definition of feasibility. So we think the OPA needs a definition of feasibility consistent with the findings of the court case in Surfrider versus Regional Board. We also think that there's guidance needed to be provided to the regional board with respect to the standards of performance for the brine discharge technologies. We talk about